This video describes the concept of governance zones and how they're implemented in ODPi Egeria. As the number of assets within an organisation grows, it's necessary to be able to group them together in order to manage and govern them. A governance zone is a simple concept. It's basically a set of assets that are related in some way. And there are many ways in which you could relate assets together, and so the definition of zones is something that each organisation can choose. But typically they're looking to group their assets by attributes such as the location of the asset, how they're being used throughout the organisation, the business unit that owns them, and maybe the life cycle state that they are in as the asset is processed and used throughout the organisation. Now, it stands to reason with all those different types of ways of grouping assets together that when you think of a single asset, it's going to belong to multiple zones. And it's also going to change zones throughout its life. So we need a very flexible mechanism to allow an asset to flow and move between the zones that it's operating in. So really, the zone should be thought of as a set rather than a location where the assets move between. It's really, it sort of belongs to multiple sets. Once you've grouped assets into zones, there are many different governance use cases that are possible. For example, if you've grouped assets according to a location, then you can start to think about data sovereignty use cases and the ability to adjust policies and rules for different legal jurisdictions. The zones themselves can be used to limit the visibility of different assets and also to control access to the asset. Now, when we say control access to the asset, that's actually the metadata, but we can take it one step further and use it to control access to the data itself. The automated systems that operate data lakes and other types of data management aspects can also be controlled by zones. For example, the archiver can be running against assets that have been moved into a trash can or obsolete zone. Backup processing could be applied to assets that are put into a derived data zone. So there are many different ways in which you can simplify the organisation and management of data by using these zones. Another use case is metering and billing. So, for example, a particular business unit could be charged based on the number of assets they have or the amount of processing that's going on in association with them. And finally, we can use these zones to create a new understanding of their dependencies. Here's an example. So this is a lineage graph. It's showing the flow of data between a number of assets in order to achieve a specific goal. If we overlay the zones that these assets belong to, you can start to see that most of the processing is happening in Amsterdam, the orange area. However, at the start, there's some data that comes from London, and then partway through, we fold in some data from New York. So from here we can see the interdependencies that are occurring between the locations in order to achieve a specific result. So now I'm going to go into a demo to show you some of these features operating in ODPi Egeria. I'm going to use two characters from the Cocoa Pharmaceuticals scenarios. The first is Callie Cortal. She's a data scientist. She's working on a clinical trial and is waiting for data to come in as part of the interactions with the various hospitals that they're working on. Peter Profile, he's an information analyst and he's responsible for the onboarding of data from third parties. What we're going to show is the cataloguing of a new asset as it comes in, some validation on the fields, how zones can be set automatically, a separation of duties use case, as well as the control of visibility of the asset. Throughout the demonstration, I'm using a Postman client. So this is, if you've never seen Postman before, it basically allows you to enter and modify the URLs and request bodies that are sent to a server through a REST interface, and then also see the responses that come back. So it's a very useful way of being able to understand and validate the behavior of a particular server without needing to go through a client user interface. I'm going to begin the demo by asking Peter to create a new clinical trial asset. This is the command for creating a CSV file asset, and if we look at the body, you can see that this is the actual file name for the asset that we're creating, a description, display name, etc. So when I hit send, we get this unique identifier, the GUID, back in response. And I'm going to save that because I've got it set up as a variable here, and if I save it, then all of the other requests will make use of that variable when I request it. So we can try that out here by requesting the asset details back for Peter. Now, although the asset has been created, Peter can see it because he's linked to the quarantine zone. If Callie tries to receive exactly the same asset, so we're using the same variable name, she's got the same GUID, actually what happens is she gets basically an asset not found exception back, because the interface that she's using is not supporting the quarantine zone, so she can't see the asset even though it is actually in the repository. So let's go back to Peter. Now if we actually look at the description of the asset, you can see the quarantine zone's been set up, and that's what stopped Callie from seeing the asset. And also Peter's down as the current owner. Now he doesn't want to be the owner, it needs to be somebody in the clinical trials team. So he goes to update the owner, and that's this command here with a body of here. So you can see that we're going to set the owner to Tanya Tidy. So let's send that, and then have another look at that asset and see what's happened to it. Now you can see here that Tanya is now the owner, but the other curious thing that's happened is that clinical trials has now been added to the zone membership, and that's Tanya's business unit. So basically the governance zone rules have said that whenever somebody of a certain business unit is added as the owner, then their zone is added to the asset. So this is showing the zone management being able to use the data in the asset to actually add to or change the zones that are being defined by default. Okay, so we've added the asset, and now Peter wants to hand this over so that Callie can start working on it. So he tries to remove, let me actually show you the command better. So this is the command to update the governance zones, and the body actually just says clinical trials. So he's removing the quarantine from it, and the result is that he's not actually authorized to change the zone membership because of the separation of duties rules that is set up in the server. So basically he's taken out quarantine, and that's not allowed. However, and the separation of duties rule is just that the person who creates the asset is not allowed to take it out the quarantine zones. Another person needs to review the settings before it's moved out. So here's Erin, and she works with Peter, and so she's able to actually move the zone forward. So if we now look and see if Callie can see the asset, yes she can, because it's now in a zone that she has access to. Okay, so you've now seen the demo. Next question is, how is it done? So there's a number of settings and plugins and things that were required to make that demo work. The first thing is that each service, when it's deployed into a server, has a number of properties that can be set. One of them is the default zones. This sets the value that the zone will be set to if whenever a new asset is created. So when Peter created the asset for the CSV file, the zone was automatically set to quarantine, and that was due to the setting of the default zones for that service. The other one is the supported zones, and this is like a filter to say that only return and operate on assets within the listed zones, and all the others treat them as if they're actually not in the repository. So that was why Callie got an exception when she tried to access the new asset, before the zone had been updated to a zone that she had access to. The way we store zone membership is not using the graph. We actually store it as a list of names within the asset definition. So it flows with the asset wherever it goes. It's very quick to process and easy to update. The value of the zone for the asset is then queried both by the basic server capability within Egeria, but also by the server security plugin. So if you're familiar with the Egeria technology, there are two types of security plugin, one for the platform and one for the server. And it's the server one that cares about governance zones. And in fact, it's the asset interface within the server security connector that operates with the zones. So the security connector has a number of interfaces that are called to challenge a request as it comes into the server. So there's one on the edge of the server, one when we go into a new service, one as we call the operation. And then if that operation is involving assets, then the asset interface will be called. And this is the one that is passed information about the zones. And there's two parts to what it can do. The first is it can update the zone values as the processing is happening. And this was how we added clinical trials to the list of zones when Tanya Tidy's user ID was added to the ownership properties. And then the second one is basically working out whether the asset is visible or accessible to a particular user. So we can set up a rule to say that data lake assets are read-only. So if somebody has access to the asset only through the data lake, and they try and do an update, then that request would fail. The plugin is actually the security connector plugin is working on the following types of data. So there's the standard asset properties that you would expect to see, such as its GUID, its identifier, the type of asset it is, where it came from, the license associated with it, the owner, the zone membership, and any other properties associated with the asset. So those are all available to the plugin to create a good assessment of the type of asset it is. And then in addition, there's an audit header that comes from the repository that is tracking who is working on that asset. So with the audit header, you can understand which users have actually made changes to that audit header. And this was how we could do the separation of duties and prevent Peter from changing the zone, the zone of the asset by removing quarantine. So this is just a very short view of the types of things you can do with governance zones. It's a very flexible mechanism. Most of the logic I've shown you are plugin rules around security and also the setting of the properties on the server. And it's extremely powerful because of the fact that an asset can belong to multiple zones. So you have different ways of grouping the assets and then applying the most appropriate rules coming from the different types of legislation to the most appropriate groups. Thank you very much for listening.